Hey, welcome back to learning more about how our government works. I'm here with the very 1776 attire to get me in the spirit of this topic. Today we're doing 5.6, and maybe we'll get to 5.7. 5.6 is interest groups influencing policy making. So we've discussed a bit about interest groups already. We're going to go in depth a little bit more. What are these people contacting me about? And this section starts off discussing iron triangles and issue networks. Remember that interest groups are a type of linkage institution, which is why Madison is still wearing his chain above. But just what type of institution is Madison linked to? Um, Iron. Now, once again, the AP people talk about factions in Madison 10. You know, I disagree with their interpretation, but some of the things still apply, and we'll discuss that. So remember that these iron triangles can influence all three branches of government, and it is sort of think of iron, think of like permanent. It's this permanent relationship between an interest group and bureaucracy and Congress. Their movement is like a revolving door. They can continue to share information and policies and ideas and requests between it. Issue networks, however, are more temporary, and um, they can sort of stop once their issue is resolved, and they can always join back up. So when we look at policy issues, what puts pressure on policy issues to develop? We have media pressure, think tank pressure, grassroots pressure from the people, and also the special interest groups coalition pressure. My gosh, so many people have emails. Um, so let's look now at the benefits and costs of interest groups. So some of the positive things, which can also be seen as negative depending on how you look at it. There's more equal distribution of power with the more interest groups there are. They can support or halt policies on whether they should be going or stopping. They could be very broad. They could also be very specific. And when you have a bunch of different interest groups, that sort of upholds the ideals of representative republicanism and federalism. Now, what are the negative parts? They can be aggressive to people, they could be overwhelming, they can be seen as selfish, as they're just promoting their interests over those of other groups. Some interest groups are much more powerful than others. They can cause gridlock or also hyper pluralism, as so many interest groups are vying for things to happen that almost nothing gets done. And they can also have this free rider system where, you know, you may have done nothing to help the interest group, but their acts may benefit you as well. That could be seen as positive to the free riders, right? So I wanted to show you special interest group spending on House candidates for this year. So keep in mind how all this stuff sort of flows. Now we have strategies of these interest groups as well. Lobbying, they have access to legislators. In fact, many lobbyists are former legislators. We just found out a few days ago that a representative from Texas is actually resigning to become a lobbyist. These lobbyists build relationships and they help to strategize, and they gain lots of information and are very knowledgeable on what their group's about. They also have resources, right? These resources also gives them more expertise. They can do fact checking polls. They can have focus groups, all that sorts of stuff. They can have campaigns. When it comes, or I shouldn't say they have campaigns, but when it comes to campaigns, they can create ads and do all sorts of things for it. So look at here. This is how much money some of these Senate candidates this year are getting just from special interest groups. Did you guys even know that Dr. Oz is running for Senate in Pennsylvania? Have we discussed this? Okay, and look at the amount of money he's getting. Lots of individual donors to him as well. So let's check. We also have grassroots ideology, people, coming up with these ideas. People frame the issue. so they could sort of add their spin on whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. And then also the media, TV, radio, social media, the internet, robocalls, right? All these things they have at their disposal. And the more funded they are, the more they can have access to all these sorts of things in the media. All right, so now let's get into 5.7, groups influencing policy outcomes. What type of groups are there? So we're going to talk about institutional groups, professional organizations, single issue groups, and ideological groups. So first, let's break down into intergovernmental groups as type of an institutional group. All right. And think of different layers in federalism, and how so some groups can sort of break those different levels. And as different levels have their groups, it helps with federalism. Some of classes were actually watching part of the U.S. Conference of Mayors here earlier this year. Francis Suarez being the head of that here with the president. There's also professional associations. You see here, Madison is a member of the AMA. Madison's doctor. Check out that stethoscope and the little mirror headband thing. Um, the American Bar Association could be another type. Think of these as often like white collar jobs that have their own little organizations. We also have corporations. Now, I was like, once again, when I saw like the AP video just gloss over this, I'm like, this is something that should really be discussed is corporations as interest groups. Look at the money that interest groups spend with lobbying. Look how much Johnson and Johnson spends. Look how much Coca-Cola spends. Also, look at the issue about Nike and Coca-Cola lobbying Congress to not ban goods that come from China's certain regions where the, let's say, human rights issues are really poor. Right? Like we should know about this stuff. We also have professional organizations. Um, Professional organizations, they have purposeful incentive, solidarity incentives, and material incentives. So these organizations have memberships and fees for people to join. A purposeful incentive might be members can join for a good cause, like I want to really help. A solidarity incentive might be like it's a gathering with a bunch of like-minded people. Who wouldn't want to do that? And a material incentive might be like if I join, I get a discount or some sort of benefit like that. Then we have single interest groups, a group that really just focuses on one thing, such as the NRA, which really focuses on being all about the Second Amendment. The double AARP, we talk about them, care about senior citizens, so things like that. Lastly, we have ideological groups. They narrow on an area of concern that they appeal to ideologically, socially. It's really more awkward recording these things in schools than at home. Have you noticed? Anyways, so some examples here would be the ACLU, which is the American Civil Liberties Union. We have WOW above and the NAACP below. So let's focus a little bit more on some of these social movements. The progressive era is often seen as the beginning of the social movement era. That's not completely true. I mean, abolitionists, they were concerned about social movements, but in a much broader and more mainstream scale, the progressives the late 1800s, early 1900s is really when this begins. And they help pass three of these amendments that we have mentioned here. The 16th Amendment about income taxes, the 17th Amendment about direct election of senators, and the 19th Amendment about women's suffrage. Yay! All right, so let's look at the civil rights movement. The NAACP was started in 1909 with the help of W.E.B. Du Bois, who's actually a distant cousin of mine. I can talk to you more about that if you want. So I love reading his stuff, just knowing that. I'd love to read it anyways. But it had a big rise in membership in the 1950s and 60s as the civil rights movement grew. Above, you see a map of NAACP branches. This map itself is from 1917. So you can see as a lot of soldiers, as a lot of African American soldiers, as some were coming back from World War One, they're like, why was I fighting for a country and their democracy if I don't have all my rights here? And you really start to see an increase even then before the civil rights movement. We also have the women's rights movement. Um, there were talks of women's issues before the official women's rights movement, but it really helps get a big send off with the Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls in 1848. You may notice that that also correlates with the abolitionist movement, and that's not a coincidence. In many cases, they worked very closely together. You'll see Frederick Douglass was one of the speakers here. You also see others really important to the women's rights movement, Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And while this movement did split into two, they still had a main objective, and that main objective was women's suffrage. After women's suffrage was granted, it then sort of split into multiple different groups with multiple different goals. Not all of the women's rights movements agreed with the same goals or the same journey to those goals afterwards. So the AP videos mentioned the book, The Feminine Mystique. I want to make sure to mention the author, Betty Friedan, here. Okay, we also have the environmental movement. Now, it sort of makes sense that that really wasn't even much of a movement before the Industrial Revolution, before there's like mass issues with pollution. But it really takes off after the book Silent Spring is published by Rachel Carson. And this book really shows like how the pesticide industry and these chemicals are like not just harming people, but the environment. Oh, I wanted to mention also that the women's rights movements, if you want to go back, dealt with things like also Roe v. Wade in 1773, Title IX in 1972, the Equal Rights Amendment also, which did pass Congress but didn't pass through the states. But anyway, Rachel Carson wrote this book in 1962, so you see it's still like as an angle of the civil rights era. And from this, you see an increase in awareness and an increase in groups forming, interest groups forming because of it. Groups like the Sierra Club, the Wilderness Society, the Audubon Society. I'll tell you what, when I was recording these videos for you guys yesterday, there was like this cool red finch outside my window that I have never seen. And when I was home working for COVID, I started seeing lots of new types of birds. So I was like, man, I should be a member of the Audubon Society. I even got a pair of binoculars for Christmas because, so thank you, Rachel Carlson, for helping, or Carson for helping groups like this want to get created. As a result of these groups, you have some legislation that takes place. We have the Clean Air Act. Now that was 64. This is different. You have some different updated versions. We have the EPA created in 1970. We have the first Earth Day in 1970. That's coming up at the end of April. We have super funds created in 1980. Basically, if you were a company that like works with things like oil that can like spill and really damage the environment, you had a certain tax for that. If these disasters created, there was then the money to clean up these disasters. Right, and then we have the consumer movement, and this really started in 1962 with JFK's Bill of Consumer Rights. The idea, like, you need to be knowing to know like what you're buying or what you're consuming. You should know if there's a lead or asbestos in it. You should know if it can be harmful. You should know if there's chemicals in it. All those sorts of things. And also, you want to have a guarantee of your product safety. You ever hear about all these product recalls? Quite often, companies will have recalls on their own once they know something's wrong. But if they don't right away, then the government might have to have a recall of these things. So another interest group would be the Consumer Federation of America, and then the government little bureaucracy called the Consumer Product Safety Commission. Um, Here was an issue during the government shutdown. A lot of these recalls don't happen. Can that be dangerous for the community? And it's worth knowing as well that this is really where Ralph Nader got his claim to fame, was really wanting to speak up for consumers and making sure they have all the knowledge. Like I saw an article this week about Johnson and Johnson. Remember, they had to stop making baby powder because there was an ingredient that caused cancer. Apparently, they knew about that long before they took it off. So, should they be held responsible? And if they should be held responsible, remember what I showed you about how much those lobbyists pay to Congress? You think that might protect them a little bit? Things to think about. All right, guys. I'll try to record the next one at home where it's not so weird.